Did St. Germain call marijuana the death drug? We talked about the spiritual aspects of it, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about the spiritual aspects, but even more importantly this evening, about the physical aspects. So before we answer that question, I'd like to give a little of the recent history of marijuana. As you know, there is a big push to legalize the recreational use of marijuana in this nation. But this is actually not the first time this has happened. There was quite a momentum building for legalization in the 1970s. You can see in this graph on the screen that popular support of marijuana, for the legalization of marijuana peaked around 1978, and then it declined through the 1980s. You can see around 1990 things shifted again with a steady rise to about 2008, and people thinking that it should be legalized, and a more rapid rise after that. So a question is, what has caused these change in attitudes? There are a lot of different factors, but here is a survey from 2015 that gives some clues. The text is probably a little bit small to see there, but this is among the 53% who think that marijuana should be legal, the main reason why they feel this way. Medical benefits was the first reason, 41%. Not as dangerous as other drugs, 36%. Benefits of regulation, such as tax revenues, 27%, and others were a lot less than that. So the reason that's most often given is medical benefits, 41% of people. Without getting into the specifics of possible medical uses of marijuana, let's have a look at that issue. Medical marijuana is now legal in 33 states. In most of them, it was approved by voter initiative rather than by legislation. This was the case in Montana. For the most part, people who voted for these measures thought they were approving marijuana for terminal cancer patients. But what they got was actually something very different. It was more like marijuana for teenagers with headaches. In practice, almost anyone who wanted to could get a medical marijuana card. All you had to do was go to a pot doctor, claim to have pain somewhere, and you could get a medical marijuana card. Often it was good for life. Keith Stroop, head of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, gave the game away when he said, "Medical marijuana is a red herring to help usher in legalized marijuana." Most importantly, the push for medical marijuana was an enormously successful effort to remake the image of the drug. It was now no longer a dangerous drug, but something you could use for your health. One thing that makes the deceptive nature of the medical marijuana campaigns very clear is that it wasn't aimed at allowing use of marijuana in the medical system, which has safeguards and approves drugs based on their effectiveness and safety. None of that happened with medical marijuana. Just one of the problems with medical marijuana being totally outside the medical system is the lack of safeguards in the manufacture of the product. Contamination with substances such as mold, bacteria, solvents, heavy metals, pesticides, and other chemicals is very common. But perhaps the biggest problem is the profit motive. We know how this has led to major problems with drug companies encouraging doctors to overprescribe. This is a primary cause of the opioid crisis that we have in America at the moment. But there are rules in the drug industry, even if they are sometimes broken. For example, doctors should not make money when they prescribe medications to patients. It would be clearly unethical and an obvious conflict of interest for them to do that, and there are rules about that. For medical marijuana, these safeguards do not exist. It's usually the sellers that are doing the prescribing. The more they sell, the more money they make. They have absolutely no incentive to say, you don't need this drug, there is a better alternative, or you don't need it anymore. One example of how this plays out. The National Institute of Drug Abuse reports, quote, "In one study of dispensaries, non-medical personnel at marijuana dispensaries were recommending marijuana to pregnant women for nausea. This concerns medical experts because marijuana use during pregnancy is linked to lower birth weight and increased risk of both brain and behavioural problems in babies. Then there are the medical marijuana dispensaries that advertise free new patient gifts of marijuana edibles. They are obviously promoting recreational use under the guise of medical. Just think about the implications of that for a minute. Would you go to a doctor who gave out free bottles of oxycodone to new patients? The second most common reason people give for legalization of recreational marijuana is that it is not as dangerous as other drugs. And this is the primary focus of our presentation this evening. A large majority of Americans do believe this. Here's a survey. 70% say marijuana is less risky than alcohol. 76% say it's less risky than tobacco. 67% say it's less risky than opiates. So we know that Saint Germain has called marijuana the death drug, something he hasn't said about alcohol. So why is marijuana worse? Apart from the spiritual reasons we spoke about on Thursday evening, here is one possible reason. While you are under the influence of alcohol, the Masters have said that you are disconnected from your Holy Christ self. This correlates with what everyone knows, that people under the influence do things they would not normally do. What is actually happening is that they no longer hear the voice of conscience, which is the voice of their Holy Christ self. And it even correlates to the areas of the brain which are affected first by alcohol. Alcohol is a water-soluble chemical. It replaces water in the bloodstream, and it is quickly removed from the body. It is metabolized by the liver at the rate of about 1 ounce per hour. So if you have a few drinks, the alcohol is gone from your system after several hours. If people have an occasional drink, most of the time they don't have any alcohol in their system. Even most daily drinkers don't have alcohol in their system continuously, so they are not under the influence of the drug all the time. Of course, there is long-term damage to the brain. But marijuana is very different. THC, the primary psychoactive component of marijuana, is a fat-soluble chemical. The mechanisms by which it is cleared from the body are very different, and it takes a lot longer. Here are some rules of thumb from pro-marijuana sites. For a light user, if you want to pass the drug test, you need to abstain from marijuana for at least a week. And that's just passing a test. At that point, you still have measurable THC in your blood. If you use marijuana several times a week, it will be 3 weeks before you can pass a blood test. For daily users, it's a month or more before you can pass a blood test. In other words, you have marijuana in your system that long after you used it the last time. Even more than this, because it is fat-soluble, THC gets into the fatty tissues of the body, where it can persist for a very long time, months and even years. And the brain is 30% fat. The bottom line is that even occasional users are never free from the drug, physically. Long after the initial high has passed, the drug is still in their system. The more they use, the more it builds up. They get used to being under the influence of the drug until that seems normal, and they gradually forget how they were when they weren't taking the drug. So we heard Mother talk about the physical substance in the body that the entity ties into. So you have this substance, THC, in the body continuously, even if you only smoke the drug, use the drug very occasionally. But that's not all. As well as the effects it has on the functioning of the brain, the THC that persists in the body is a physical anchor point for the entity. It takes, and we heard about the characteristics of that entity, how it's kind of the laid-back consciousness, the lack of striving. It takes striving to balance your karma, to make it on the spiritual path. The consciousness of marijuana is the very opposite of this. It is anti-striving. If you're not making progress on the path, you're going backwards. Rather than the goal of the ascension, marijuana therefore leads you in the opposite direction, the death of the soul. And to me, that is a very important reason why Saint Germain called it the death drug. But this isn't just metaphysical. The statistics are there, the studies are in, that prove the very real physical dangers of marijuana. The most alarming information is the effect of the drug on teenagers and the proven connection with mental illness. Here are just a few of those studies. Long-term studies in Australia and New Zealand showed that compared to those who never used the drug, teens who use marijuana weekly or more before the age of 17 were 60% more likely to drop out of high school, 4 times more likely to attempt suicide, and nearly 5 times more likely to use other illegal drugs later in life. With daily use, these numbers were even worse. A study of 50,000 recruits in the Swedish Army found that those who used marijuana heavily at age 18 were 3 times more likely to develop schizophrenia over the next 15 years. Here's the raw data from that study, which is probably too small to read, but this is a very solid study, and they corrected for all sorts of other factors that could have been influencing the outcome, and the authors actually concluded that the data showed a cause-effect relationship between marijuana use and schizophrenia. One of the most important long-term studies is one conducted in Dunedin, New Zealand. They found that people who had used cannabis at age 15 were 4 times more likely to go on to develop psychosis and schizophrenia. They also found that consuming marijuana regularly leads to up to an 8-point loss in IQ, about the same as lead poisoning. Quote, cessation of cannabis use did not fully restore neuropsychological functioning among adolescent-onset cannabis users. In other words, the damage caused was permanent. Analysing the same data further, other researchers found that for people with a specific variant of the COMT gene, which affects dopamine regulation in the brain, teenage use of marijuana increased their risk of developing psychosis 10 times. That's not even heavy use. That's as little as 3 to 5 times using the drug in the teenage years leads to increased risk of developing it 10 times if they have this specific variant of this gene. The brain is developing rapidly during those years, and the scientific proof is there. The damage done by the drug at that time has permanent long-term effects. But when do you ever hear about these facts in the debates about legalizing marijuana? The studies go on and on. A Dutch study in 2002 found the same link to mental illness. Quote, the scientists estimated that cannabis use might be responsible for as much as half of the serious psychosis in previously healthy adults. Here is one website where you can find more links to more of these studies. It's www.schizophrenia.com/prevention/streetdrugs.html#. And note that this is not an anti-drug site. It is a site to help people who are dealing with schizophrenia and their family members. Something very important to remember is that many of these long-term studies are for people who started using marijuana in the 1960s and 1970s. The marijuana today is very different. Here's a chart showing the average THC levels in marijuana. In the 1960s and 1970s, you can see it was 1% or less. This chart goes up to 2011, where potencies were more than 11%. These days, the average is over 20%, with some strains having up to 38%. So, here's a joint, 1970s, 1 milligram of THC. That same joint today could have 20 milligrams of THC. You may know people who smoked marijuana back in the 60s or 70s, but how many do you know who used to smoke 20 joints a day back then and get 20 milligrams a day? And how did they turn out? But these days, people don't just smoke marijuana. There are thousands of edible marijuana products. Here are just a few. For example, did you know that you can get gummy bears with 10 milligrams of THC? Advertising suggests taking 1 or 2 when you need, quote, a slight lift. They are described as, quote, a harmless addition to your wellness routine. What do you think would happen if someone tried to sell nicotine gummy bears? How long would that last? You can get a fruit punch drink with 100 milligrams of THC in an 8-ounce bottle, 200 milligrams in some states. Chocolate bar with 200 milligrams of THC. Bud Head gourmet sodas with 500 milligrams of THC. And there's a brownie with 1,000 milligrams of THC. A legal serving of THC in Colorado is supposed to be 10 milligrams. Even that could be too much for someone who hasn't built up a tolerance to the drug. So you take your little fruit punch drink, within the bottle with the fruit on the outside, and you're supposed to drink just a tenth of it, just a few sips, and then you're supposed to put the rest back in the fridge or whatever you do with it. Look at this brownie. This brownie is 1,000 milligrams of THC. So theoretically, you're supposed to only take a tenth of it. How many people do you think do that? You can buy this brownie online for $10.50. One problem with edibles is that it takes up to a couple of hours for the THC to be absorbed in your system. So people who are new to edibles try one gummy bear, for example, the recommended legal dose. An hour later, they're not feeling anything, so they have a few more. If they're not used to it, they can find themselves in a lot of trouble very quickly. Ben Court, author of Weed, Inc., recounts stories of people with no history of mental illness who went into psychotic episodes in just this scenario. One 19-year-old exchange student had an eighth of an 80 milligram THC cookie. When it seemed like nothing was happening, he ate the rest of the cookie. He started acting wild, punching holes in things, and ended up jumping off the balcony and killing himself. There's another story of a man who shot his wife in front of his 7-year-old son. A 23-year-old shot himself in the head. To repeat, these people had no history of mental illness, but temporary psychosis was induced purely by the THC. And these are just a few of the cases just from Colorado. They were almost totally ignored by the media. Do the research and you can find a lot more. And still, the pot lobby claims, quote, no one ever died from marijuana. It's just an outright lie. Then there are the concentrates. Here's a picture of the different concentrates you can get these days. These can be more than 90% pure THC. A recommended dose of one of these is as little as half a pinhead. How many people get that wrong and accidentally take too much, and with what effects? How can you say this is a safe drug? When you take a grain of rice worth and you can end up psychotic and killing yourself or killing your family members. Anyone can walk in off the street and buy these in Colorado. Even some people who are in favour of legal cannabis think this is just insane. The long-term studies show that the damage done by marijuana increases with dose. Those studies are based on people who used to get a few milligrams. What are the long-term effects going to be of young people taking the kinds of doses freely available today? The answer is nobody knows. It's a giant experiment with the mental and physical health of the youth of America. Maybe we will find out in 10 years, or even then, maybe the drug lobby will be able to suppress the evidence. In the face of industry lobbying, it took decades for the truth about tobacco to emerge. How long will it take for the public to learn the truth about the damage caused by marijuana? Meanwhile, CNN is featuring stories by Dr. Sanjay Gupta about how safe medical marijuana is. See Dr. Gupta there, smiling Dr. Gupta, holding a marijuana leaf. What's the message of this picture? It's safe, right? The mainstream media is well and truly on the marijuana bandwagon. This image reminds me of those old Camel ads with doctors. Have you seen those? More doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette. Cigarettes must be good for you, right? So, that's exactly the same strategy. A doctor endorsing the drug, it must be okay. Dr. Gupta says of marijuana, quote, "It is hard to make a case that it is a high potential for abuse." Keith Bradley, someone who actually works with people with drug problems, says, "I would rather do an intervention on a heroin addict who has been shooting dope on the street for years than someone who has been using concentrates for 6 months." That's how addictive he considers it is. Already in California, more young people are entering treatment for marijuana use than all other drugs combined, including alcohol. One of the arguments people make for marijuana is that God made it. Well, you might argue that God made the original marijuana plant found in nature, which probably had a lot less than 1% THC and had an equal amount of CBD, which tends to counteract the effects of the THC. Of course, whether God wanted you to stick it in your mouth and set it on fire is another question. But God didn't make Ghost Train Haze marijuana with 25% THC, and he certainly didn't make gummy bears with 10 milligrams of THC. It's like saying God made the coca plant, therefore crack cocaine must be good for you. But then, of course, we know that these drugs weren't actually made by God in the first place, but by the Nephilim, who brought them with them from the 12th planet. Attitudes to marijuana have shifted enormously in the last 20 years. The rebranding of marijuana as medicine was part of that strategy. Another part is that Hollywood and the media have been actively working to make marijuana cool. One example of this is how marijuana use was portrayed in the television show Beverly Hills 90210. From 1990 to 2000, the show portrayed marijuana in an overwhelmingly negative light. When the show was revived in 2008 to 2013, marijuana was portrayed as cool. The Discovery Channel and National Geographic played their part with series about marijuana. The Discovery Channel had a series called Weed Wars, and National Geographic had one called American Weed. How much more family values can you get than National Geographic? But perhaps the most effective propaganda piece was the Showtime series Weeds, a comedy about a suburban mum who takes up selling weed to support her family. She lives in an upper middle-class community where seemingly everyone is an avid smoker or indifferent about the drug. One critic maintained that, quote, "Television certainly played a role in shifting public attitudes about marijuana, lending momentum to legalization efforts, just as the medium has done with countless other controversial issues. Weeds probably deserves a lion's share of the credit for television's role in reshaping the national discourse. When the show debuted in 2005, Americans thought marijuana should remain illegal by a 2-to-1 margin. By the end of the last season, in 2012, it was about 50-50. Another factor has been a couple of billionaires, George Soros and Peter Lewis, who have each spent more than $100 million of their own money to fund campaigns to legalize marijuana. Local groups fighting proposals for legalization find themselves outspent 10-to-1 by the billionaires and now by the marijuana industry. So, how do we turn this around? Public attitudes can change. Let's look again at that chart showing attitudes to legalization. There was a big push for legalization in the 70s. Perhaps the high point was when President Carter's drug policy advisor, Dr. Peter Bourne, was caught snorting cocaine at a normal party. But things changed when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. He made the war on drugs a major policy initiative. Nancy Reagan launched the Just Say No campaign. She was ridiculed, but one pro-drug history has said that, quote, "She, possibly more than any single individual, is responsible for the drug panic." That's what this pro-drug author describes the anti-drug campaigns during the 1980s as. As well as leadership from the top, there was a real grassroots movement. parents saw what was happening to their kids on marijuana and they didn't like it. They got organised, forming dozens of organisations to fight the drug problem. Partnership for a Drug-Free America was founded by a group of advertising executives. They pioneered a whole new approach to the problem, using all of the techniques that advertisers were using to sell products to unsell drugs. Their most famous ad was this one, which you probably saw. This is your brain on drugs. These campaigns really did work. Use of marijuana among high school students declined dramatically in the 1980s. Here's a chart showing percentage of US 12th graders reporting daily marijuana use and perceived risk. The message on the dangers was getting out. Marijuana became uncool, something that losers did. Look at this graph, an 80% reduction in the number of 12th graders using marijuana daily. An 80% reduction from about 1979 to 1993. And public support for legalization was also totally turned around during that time. Another hopeful precedent is England. In 2001, more than half of British adults favoured decriminalisation. In 2004, the government reclassified marijuana from Class B to Class C, effectively decriminalising it. Alex Berenson, author of Tell Your Children, tells the story of Rowan Murray and the Institute of Psychiatry in London. Murray co-authored more than 80 papers on the links between cannabis and psychosis. The Institute provided a steady stream of information to politicians and the media. In 2007, The Independent, a leading British paper, reversed its earlier support for decriminalisation. And in October 2008, the British government put it back in Class B. By 2010, only 1 in 3 favoured decriminalisation. A 2016 survey of UK students showed that they'd strongly associated cannabis with mental health problems. The word was getting out. So can things be turned around here? The evidence of the dangers is clear, but the problem is it's not reaching people. There's been a very successful PR marketing campaign by the billionaires and the drug industry to remake the image of the drug. One problem is researchers in America generally aren't as interested in the topic as those in other nations. There is a lot of money to be made in America in finding a new drug to treat schizophrenia, but no money at all in finding that you can reduce the incidence of schizophrenia by cutting teen marijuana use. So most of these epidemiological studies are done in other nations rather than in America. It's not going to be easy to turn it around given the amount of money behind the campaign to legalise marijuana. However, that doesn't mean it can't happen. These examples show that it is possible. The first step, I believe, is to get educated. We've only had time to give a very brief overview this evening and on Thursday. Do your own research. There are some very good books on the subject. Here are 2 that I recommend, and we had them for sale in our conference bookstore. The first one is Alex Berenson, Tell Your Children, The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness and Violence. Berenson does an excellent job of making the research accessible and understandable. As well as the links to mental illness, he also talks about links between legalization of marijuana and an increase in violent crime, something we haven't had time to even talk about this evening. The proponents of marijuana even claim that there was a reduction in violent crime in states that legalized marijuana. In fact, the statistics are exactly the opposite. And Berenson actually explains why exactly this is happening. The second is by Ben Court, Weed Inc., The Truth About the Pot Lobby, THC and the Commercial Marijuana Industry. Now, Ben Court is a drug counsellor. He actually supports responsible, quote, recreational use by adults. So I would certainly not endorse everything he says, but he does a really excellent job of exposing the very real dangers of the drug. I really like his section titled, How to Respond to What the 17-Year-Olds Throw at You. I think he's also very credible for people who think that, legalization of marijuana is good, because they have some common ground with him. So I think they're more likely to believe it when he says that what is happening now is very dangerous. So educate yourself, share these books with friends, children, family members, promote them on social media, do everything you can to get the word out. Something we did in the 80s, Mother had Keepers of the Flame go out and talk about the problem of marijuana. There are a couple of Keepers of the Flame who had a program. They used to go around and present it at schools. It was called Waking Up from Dope. So we can do our decrees on this, and we need to do our decrees on this. We've made it our minor decree focus for this quarter. But I think we also need to provide the chalice and the physical for the masters to work through. And part of that is getting out there ourselves and getting the message out. One thing we're going to do to help you with that is we're going to make the script of this lecture available to you on the member area of our website, so that you can give it. You can give it in your study group, you can give it at a local school, you can give it to a PTA, wherever you can find an audience to hear the message about marijuana. And this presentation this evening, there's a couple of things you wouldn't want to include in that public audience, like you don't need to tell them about marijuana from the 12th planet, but it's not going to help. But there's a lot of really solid evidence and research here, and I footnoted most of the statistics so you can follow up yourself and find out more. It took a fiat from an Archangel Jofiel, for the dangers of tobacco to be revealed to the American people. Attitudes and laws regarding tobacco since that time have changed dramatically since then. So let us make our own fiat that the truth about marijuana will be revealed to the American people, and may this fiat be answered by the hosts of the Lord. And let us do the spiritual work for the binding and judgment of the marijuana beast and the money beast that work side by side to enslave the people of this nation. So let us sing now Song 762 before we go into our decrees on this subject.